Hi there, and welcome to another lesson from Simply PE, this time looking at the cardiac cycle. So a reminder of these presentations: the yellow text boxes are the tasks for students, the green text boxes are the note-taking sections for students, the blue text boxes are differentiation tasks, and the red text boxes are the teaching and learning strategies and ideas for the practitioner. So in regards to this specific topic, what do you need to know for the GCSE syllabus in terms of AQA? Well, first of all, you need to be able to understand the structure of the heart. So be able to label different parts of the heart and understand and recognise what those key names are. Second of all, you need to be able to understand the two phases of that cardiac cycle. So diastole and systole, you need to be able to understand the different phases in regards to those two key processes. And then finally, you need to be able to understand the pathway that blood takes as it flows through the heart to the working muscles, and the blood that flows through the heart back to the lungs. So that's what we're going to look at today, and let's get cracking. Okay, so let's start by looking at the structure of the heart. So the first thing that we need to recognise is what the heart is. So it's the main vital organ within our body that we need in order for us to be and stay alive. So the heart functions, okay, as four specific chambers that we're going to look at in particular in a minute. But its main purpose is to pump blood around the body. So oxygenated blood to the working muscles, but also deoxygenating blood back to the lungs. And finally, as it says there, we can divide the heart into two sides, so a left side and a right side. And we can also ensure that we divide the heart up into an upper and lower part as well. So in essence, we've got four parts of the heart, and you can see on that diagram there that I've put basically two kind of lines which kind of cross in the middle of the heart to show you the four specific sections of the heart. So we have our four specific parts, our four specific sections of the heart. And it's also worth noting, as you can see in the diagram, the right-hand side of the heart works and focuses on the deoxygenated blood, and that's why that diagram is coloured at the moment in blue. And on the left-hand side of the heart, that works with transporting oxygenated blood around the body. So if we think of the heart, if we think first of all of the upper chambers, so the top part of the heart, we can see that the chambers are referred to as the atria. So we have the left atrium and the right atrium that you should be able to see on that diagram. The lower parts of the heart, the two chambers there, are referred to as the ventricles. So again, the left ventricle and the right ventricle. The atria, as it says there, collects blood from the veins. Okay, so remember the purpose of veins, okay, is to bring things back, or bring blood back to the heart. Okay, and then if we think of therefore arteries, arteries take blood away from the heart. So it says there the ventricles pump blood out through the arteries. So we're going to look specifically now at being able to label our diagrams. So the next few slides you'll need to sketch the diagram in a bit more detail. So before we do that, before we sketch out our heart, which we're actually going to do on the next slide after this one, it's worth looking at that diagram to start seeing the process of how blood fills up in both the left atrium and the right atrium, and then moves down to the left ventricle and to the right ventricle before going off in their separate paths to either the lungs or to the working muscles. So as I said before, the right hand side takes deoxygenated blood to the lungs for oxygenation, and that's to recoup and to collect that oxygen, remember, through the alveoli, through those tiny air sacs that we'll find in the lungs. The left side receives that oxygenated blood from the lungs, and then it looks to pump the blood through to various arteries and then to the various muscles, body tissues, okay, because that is obviously transporting the oxygen and the nutrients that we require for energy for movement. The question there says, what separates the left and right side of the heart? So pause your video here. Let's see if you've got some of that general knowledge, because I haven't gone through that yet in the lesson. Okay, so hopefully you've had a think about it, you've thought about it, and the answer is the septum. So in the middle of the heart here, where you can see the left and right ventricle filling up and then contracting and moving that blood on through either the pulmonary artery or aorta. But what you should also be able to see is in the middle there, you've got a section which separates that ventricle up, and that is called the septum. That's a wall, that's a tissue of wall that is found in the middle of the heart. So again, before we label our diagram, which actually is on the next slide now, sorry, I thought it was this slide here, let's look at the cardiac cycle, what it means and what it refers to in the two phases that we're looking at for the syllabus. So first and foremost, the cardiac cycle is the sequence of events that occurs when the heart beats. So when we think of cardiac cycle, we are thinking of our heart beating, and what does that actually mean? What is the two phases that are happening there as our heart beats? So first and foremost, if we look at diastole, this is where the ventricles relax and the heart fills up with blood. So the left atrium and the right atrium during the diastole phase will start to fill up with blood, both oxygenated on the left hand side, deoxygenated on the right hand side, and there they'll then move down towards the lower chambers, the left ventricle and the right ventricle. So the diastole is the phase here where the heart isn't contracting, it's relaxing. Systole is the opposite. So this is now where the heart actually beats, it contracts. This is where it pumps out and moves on the blood out of the heart. And you should be able to see that through the diagram there. It's the second phase, the lower chambers, which are now moving that deoxygenated blood back to the lungs and the oxygenated blood to the different body tissues, the different working muscles around the body. So as it says there, systole is the ventricles contracting and the blood is pumped out by the heart. So one cardiac cycle, okay, refers to a single heart contraction or a single heartbeat. So when we think of that, we can also think of the word pulse. So sometimes your teacher, your PE teacher, might ask you to find your pulse. And when we're doing that, we're trying to find our heartbeat, okay? And we can feel that single contraction taking place pretty regularly over time. So again, pause your video here. I want you to see if you can answer these two questions. First and foremost, what is blood pressure? So what do we mean by that term blood pressure? And second of all, what is a pulse rate per minute a good measure of? So have a think about that. So when we think about blood pressure, what do we actually mean by that? So that term blood pressure basically refers to the measure of the force of blood which is being moved in an artery. Okay, so when we think of blood pressure, normally we should get two scores there. So 120 over 90, for example, is an average, a healthy blood pressure score. So that top number will normally refer to the systole phase, and the reason being, remember, if we think of the systole phase, that's where the heart is contracting, so it's pumping that blood out, so the force should be higher, okay? And when the heart relaxes, okay, during that phase of diastole, that's when there's no pressure, or there's not as much pressure, okay, and hence why that score will always be lower than the systole. Okay, so 120 over 60, for example, or 120 over 90 would be kind of somewhere in the region of an average score. And if you're thinking of that second question in terms of the pulse rate per minute, what's that a good indication of? Well, it's a good indication of your fitness. Okay, so our pulse rate, that if it's lower over the course of a minute, that means our heart is beating less times, and we'll look at why that might be when we start to think of the longer term effects of exercise. But ultimately, if our heart is stronger, okay, and we have heart hypertrophy, so there's a slight increase in size and it's slightly stronger, then we'll have an increase of stroke volume, so the amount of blood going to the working muscles. And if that's the case, then obviously that should determine our pulse rate to be slightly lower. Our heart needs to beat less times per minute because we have a stronger heart. So that's the reason why we look at the pulse rate per minute as a good indication of fitness. So I'm now going to take myself off the screen here just so that you can see this diagram fully, and you can maybe jot it down, and it'd be worth labeling some of or most of the parts of this diagram. What I would say is with the two valves, the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve, for the AQA GCSE exam, you don't need to know specifically those two valve names. But you do need to know you do need to understand the functions of a valve, especially within the heart. So I'm just going to leave that in there for you. There's no harm in kind of jotting that down as well. So let's look at the pathway of blood, or the flow of blood that happens within the heart. So during that diastole phase, so during the phase of where the heart is relaxing, it says that atria and the ventricles are relaxed, and the atrioventricular valves, so the bicuspid and tricuspid valves here, are opened up. So you should be able to see within the diagram that if we have the filling up of the heart through the left atrium and the right atrium, and if you look at those white arrows to help you in terms of the pathway there, is that eventually they move down into the left and the right ventricle, and they do that by going through those two valves, the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve, which open up to allow that flow. As it says there, the vena cava, which you should be able to see at the top left hand of the diagram, but the top right of the heart. So the main vein brings back deoxygenated blood to that right atrium. Now, upon systole, so once the blood has moved to both of those ventricles, the right ventricle and the left ventricle, they are now ready to be transported either to the lungs, which we're going to look at there in the example here in the text box, or to the working muscles if we're referring to the left atrium. So during that contraction phase. And what happens there is both valves, the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve, will now close during the systole phase, and that ensures that the blood flow goes through that pulmonary artery, okay, or through to the aorta, and it prevents backflow into the right atrium or to the left atrium. So it's a really kind of clever system in that sense to avoid any backflow, so the blood can only go out in two specific directions depending on whether the blood is in the right ventricle or the left ventricle. A couple of questions for you to try and answer here in thinking about the atrioventricular valves. Why do they close during that systole phase? And second of all, describe the journey of the blood as it enters the heart from the lungs. Okay, so pause the video here, see if you can answer them. Okay, so hopefully you've answered both those questions. So the first answer to the question in terms of why do the valves close? Well, ultimately during the systole phase, well, ultimately, as we've mentioned before, it prevents that backflow. Okay, so that's really, really important to note, and hopefully you got that answer correctly. Now, second of all, when we think of the describing the journey of the blood as it enters the heart from the lungs, so why does it go to the lungs first and foremost? Okay, so the blood goes there to reoxygenate, isn't it? To get oxygen once again, so that it can go back into the left-hand side of the heart. So we talk first and foremost about that blood coming back into the left atrium and it comes in through that pulmonary vein that you should be able to see on your diagram. As that blood enters that pulmonary vein, okay, it fills up during that diastole phase, okay, and then from there it moves through the bicuspid valve down into the left ventricle, okay, and then during that systole phase, okay, as the heart contracts, that blood will move through to the aorta and to the working muscles. And we could then mention as well during that systole phase that the bicuspid valve will then close to prevent any backflow. So hopefully you've come up with that sort of description for the journey, because it's really important. You may get a question in the exam which asks you to describe the pathway of either the oxygenated blood or the deoxygenated blood through that cardiac cycle. So let's finally look at the cardiac output in terms of this key term before we start to look at some practice exam questions to finish up of this topic for today. So first and foremost, when we look at cardiac output, we're talking about the volume of blood that the heart is able to pump out. Okay, so cardiac output is measured in litres per minute. So we think of how much volume of blood is pumped out by the heart during the course of a minute. There are two things that can affect the cardiac output. The first thing is the heart rate. So how many times the heart beats per minute can have an impact on the cardiac output. The second thing that can have an impact is the stroke volume. So how hard or how much blood is being pumped around the body in one single beat. Okay, and that's what we mean by stroke volume. So if we have a stronger, fitter heart, we should be able to pump more blood around the body than someone that is unfit and doesn't have a strong and healthy heart. So ultimately, that formula there, cardiac output, which equals heart rate times stroke volume, is the kind of formula that we need to think about when we look at that term cardiac output. So there are two questions here that we need to try and answer. What happens to cardiac output if the heart rate increases? And second of all, why does heart rate increase usually before exercise? We need to pause your video here, see if you can answer them. Okay, so hopefully you've unpaused your video here. When we think of that first question in terms of what happens to cardiac output if the heart rate increases, well, ultimately, the cardiac output will also slightly increase if we have an increase in heart rate. If we look at that formula there at the bottom, if the heart rate increases in terms of its number and the stroke volume perhaps stays the same, that's going to have an impact on the cardiac output. So ultimately, the answer to that first question is the heart rate increases, well, so will cardiac output. When we think of the second question there, why does the heart rate slightly increase usually before exercise? Well, we're kind of nervous before exercise on the whole. And if we're nervous slightly, if we're anticipating a competition or anticipating opponents or whatever else it is in terms of before we exercise, we call that an anticipatory rate. And when we think of that, there's a slight increase in our heart rate. And ultimately that means that, again, our cardiac output will slightly increase. So let's finish off the lesson by looking at some practice exam questions. There's two slides here for AO1 and then AO2. And the text boxes will be in blue just as differentiation. So if you want to look at knowledge or if you want to look at explanation, depending on your level of confidence with this specific topic. So question 1 and 2 there ask you to define cardiac output, and also can you remember what the calculation is for maximum heart rate. So pause your video here, see if you can come up with the right answers in your notes. Okay, so for cardiac output, as we talked about there, it's the amount of blood that's ejected or pumped from the heart in 1 minute. That's what we refer to and we mean by cardiac output. And in terms of the maximum heart rate, remember, we refer to that as 220 minus your age. For going back to number 1, sorry, that second bullet point there, which is stroke volume times heart rate, if you just put the formula down, that would have also got you that mark as well. Okay, and then for the exam practice AO2, question 5 and question 6 there, again, pause your video here, see if you can answer those two specific questions. First of all, explaining how the heart acts as a pump in a double circuitry system, so the cardiac cycle, and then finally question 6, what do we refer to and what do we mean by a pulse rate? So pause the video here, see if you can answer that. Okay, so for question 5, I'm not going to go through it in specific detail because I already have during the course of this lesson. But in that first bullet point, especially where it says blood kind of enters the right atrium, dark red in colour with little oxygen. I know our diagram has kind of referred to deoxygenated blood as blue, but that's obviously just to kind of show you that blue kind of normally refers to as deoxygenated and red as oxygenated. But when we think of blood which has little hemoglobin in it and it's got little oxygen in it, it would be a very rich dark red colour, okay, whereas oxygenated blood will be a brighter form and colour of red. But basically, go through the different bullet points here. You should be able to see quite clearly the different kind of pathways in terms of the blood flow. So just pause the video here if you need to kind of self-assess your answer. And then in terms of the pulse, the beat or the pump in a single contraction refers to a pulse when we talk about the heart. And then finally, for the teaching and learning strategies for the teachers, I would ensure that you try and get the students to watch some videos to kind of show that blood flow in action when we think about the heart. If possible, try and get your students up and active if they're in the classroom. Try and get them to maybe recreate the heart. So give them specific roles whereby as a class you could actually come up with improvising in class and showing the structure of the heart. You get students to kind of open and close themselves in terms of the different valves, and then get 2 students maybe to actually be the pathway of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. It just makes another way of it to be a bit more interactive. Best of luck with that task. Hope you enjoyed the content of the video. Take care.